Long before empires, before writing or bronze, a city rose from dust and dream. Jericho stood where the desert meets the Jordan, its walls older than myth, its towers older than kings. Here, humanity first learned to stay, to shape earth, to harvest time, to build what endures. Stones replaced wandering, and walls became memory written in clay and blood. Millennia later, conquerors blew their trumpets and claimed those same walls fell by divine command. Yet Jericho's true miracle was never its fall, but its beginning, the moment when humankind first chose civilization over survival, and history began to breathe. When the glaciers withdrew and warmth crept back into the bones of the earth, the Jordan Valley stirred awake. Mist drifted over the low plains, and the thawed rivers sang where ice had ruled for ages. Among reeds and limestone, a single spring broke the silence. Steady, unchanging, ancient. In time, that spring would give its name to the oldest city ever known, Jericho. Before temples rose or kings wrote their laws, there were only scattered fires around that water. What made those first wanderers stay when the rest of humankind kept moving? Perhaps that is where civilization truly began, not in invention or conquest, but in the decision to remain. Across the valley, the air shimmered with promise. The last great freeze had passed, leaving behind a land rich in game and seed, a garden drawn out of the desert. Herds crossed the plain at dawn. Birds filled the sky with their migration songs. People followed them, first for food, then for something more lasting. Those who gathered near the spring lived between two worlds, the memory of the hunt and the dream of settlement. They built shelters of brush and clay, dug hearths into the ground, and watched the seasons change without moving on. To them, the spring must have felt eternal, a rhythm older than death or drought, a promise that life could endure in one place. It began with that promise, a handful of families tending fires by the water, shaping the earth to their needs, discovering that permanence could be built, not just hoped for. From these hands, from these experiments in belonging, a new world took shape, and from that quiet valley, the long echo of humanity's first home began to rise. Across the Jordan Rift, the world was transforming. As the Pleistocene gave way to the Holocene, rainfall carved fresh veins into the land. The once hostile wilderness softened into a mosaic of oases and grasslands, home to gazelle, ibex, and migrating birds. Nature was generous again, and the people who followed its bounty, hunter bands, foragers, wanderers, began to linger longer each season. They built temporary shelters from reeds and brush, left hearthstones behind, and began to map their lives onto a single place. Humanity was turning its first corner, from wandering to waiting, from taking to tending. The people who gathered here would one day be known to us as the Natufians. They lived on the threshold between eras, neither fully nomads nor farmers, neither tribes nor citizens. Their lives followed the rhythm of ripening grain and returning herds. When archaeologists first traced their flint blades and seed-grinding stones, they found the early outline of something profound, the world's first attempt at permanence. Imagine the Jordan Valley then, not the arid strip we know today, but a lush corridor of tamarisk and fig, acacia and tall grasses. Springs burst from the cliffs, feeding streams that braided through the plain. The air shimmered with heat by noon and cooled with fog by night. It was a land of abundance surrounded by emptiness, a promise of survival framed by desert. In this cradle of green, people began to pause. They gathered wild barley and einkorn, stored them in shallow pits, and returned each year to the same place. A new instinct was forming. to build, to stay, to claim. Farther north, the mountains of Anatolia and the plains of Mesopotamia echoed with similar stirrings, small hearths glowing in the twilight of the Ice Age. But none matched the continuity of this oasis. Jericho's secret lay in its spring, Ain es-Sultan, the eternal source. Its waters, flowing unbroken since before recorded time, made the land shimmer with fertility even in drought. While rivers shifted elsewhere, here the earth held steady. That permanence would draw people again and again, even after thousands of years of change. The first traces of their settlement were modest, circular huts woven from brush and mud, roofs pressed down by clay, each hearth dug into the center. They built together, their dwellings arranged in loose rings that hinted at shared space, an early echo of community. Nearby, stone mortars held traces of crushed grain, suggesting not just gathering, but preparation, the prelude to agriculture. These were still foragers, yet their lives were slowing. They no longer drifted through the seasons. The seasons came to them. Over time, the Natufian way of life spread like ripples through the valley. Communities appeared at sites such as Wadi Hameh, Malaha, and Beda. But Jericho was different. Its soil was richer, its spring more generous, its view commanding. From this single rise above the floodplain, its people could see herds moving in the distance, the shimmer of heat across the salt flats of the Dead Sea, and the dark outlines of the Judean hills beyond. Geography had chosen its heir, and it would not be forgotten. What they built was not yet a city. There were no streets, no shrines, no written names, but they created something far more enduring, the idea of living together by design. They learned to share water, to store grain, to watch over each other's fires. They buried their dead beneath their dwellings, perhaps believing that those who came before would guard those who came after. In the quiet rhythm of their lives, one can already feel the heartbeat of civilization. To the archaeologists who later uncovered this place, to Garstang in the 1930s, to Kenyon in the 1950s, the layers of soil read like a chronicle without words. Beneath each stratum of mud brick and ash lay the story of people learning to master time itself. Beneath the latest Bronze Age ruins, they found still older traces, the Natufian hearths, the earliest huts, the bones of gazelle mixed with wild wheat. It was as though each age had built directly atop the last, unwilling to leave this oasis behind. By around 10,000 BC, the experiment had grown bold. The Natufians, or perhaps their descendants, began to shape the land deliberately. They cut channels to guide runoff, built shallow basins to collect water, and scattered seeds near their camps. The first gardens appeared, small and fragile. With them came something new, ownership. Grain had to be tended, guarded, claimed. And so, for the first time, people began to stay, not just out of need, but out of choice. Around the same time, the climate shifted again. The younger Dryas, a brief return to cold, pressed many wandering groups to the edge of survival. For those at Jericho, the oasis was refuge and salvation. Necessity turned patience into invention. The experiments with grain and goat became deliberate practice. Seeds were saved. Herds were kept. The earth began to answer the hand that worked it. From this fragile equilibrium, the first glimmer of permanence took root. Clay replaced reeds. Hearths became stone-lined. Food surpluses meant security, and security meant time. Time to imagine, to carve, to remember. Traces of ritual objects appear in the soil. Beads, figurines, shells carried from the sea. Symbols of meaning, of order, of faith. Humanity was beginning to decorate its survival. The rise of Jericho wasn't inevitable. It was born from risk, from a gamble that the earth would remain kind, that the spring would keep flowing, that community would outlast hunger. In a world still filled with wild herds and restless neighbors, choosing to stay was the boldest act imaginable. But stay they did. The fires of one generation became the foundations of another, and the mound at Ayn Sultan began to grow. Over the centuries, wind-blown dust and collapsed walls layered into a slow mountain of history. The Tell, the artificial hill that still rises over the valley today. To the untrained eye, it looks like any other rise of earth, but every inch of it is human-made, built from lives lived and rebuilt in the same place for 12,000 years. In its shadow, the story of humanity's first home is buried. By the time the first walls rose around 8,500 BC, Jericho had already become something unprecedented, a settlement that refused to die. Generation after generation, built, collapsed, and built again, drawn always to the same spring, the same fertile soil. It is this continuity, this refusal to vanish, that makes Jericho not just old, but immortal. When you stand there today, the wind sweeping over the mound and the sun burning through the haze, you can almost hear them. The first farmers grinding grain beside the water, the laughter of children among the reeds, the quiet hum of a world being born. Civilization didn't begin with kings or conquest. It began with people who decided that leaving was no longer an option. And so the story begins, not with walls or towers, but with the moment the first wanderers chose to stay. As the warmth of the new age spread across the valley, the rhythm of life began to change. The hunters still carried their flint-tipped spears and bone knives, but their movements grew slower, their ranges smaller. Near the spring, they left the footprints of a people learning patience. They were no longer driven by the chase alone. They were waiting for the grain to ripen, for the gazelle to return, for the ground itself to yield its rhythm. Archaeologists call them the Natufians, though they never named themselves. Their tools were simple but purposeful, curved sickles of flint set into bone handles, grinding stones polished smooth by countless hours of labor. Each tool told the same quiet story, the beginning of control. It wasn't yet farming, but it was close. A bridge between gathering and cultivation, between wandering and belonging. When the rains came, the low ground around the spring glistened with wild barley and emmer wheat. The Natufians plucked what they needed, but they also learned to scatter seeds in the same soil the following season. They noticed that the plants grew better where they had slept, where the ashes of their fires had fallen. It was an accident, repeated often enough to become intention. An intention, in time, became civilization's first skill. Beneath the surface, the valley's fertility had a deeper cause. The Jordan Rift lay along a scar of the Earth's crust, a place where subterranean water rose through fault lines from the highlands of Samaria and Moab. The spring Ayn Sultan never failed. Even in drought years, when rivers dried and herds moved north, water still pooled here, clear and cold. The Natufians didn't need to understand geology to recognize permanence. They built their homes around the spring, as if orbiting a star. Their dwellings were round, small sunken huts of brush, mud, and reeds, clustered together on raised terraces above the floodplain. Inside, a single hearth burned through the night, the smoke rising through a hole in the roof. When one family left or died, another built over the same ground. Layer upon layer of life pressed into the soil, leaving behind traces that would one day form the Tell, the mound of Jericho. Each hut was a world. Stone mortars lay by the door, filled with the husks of grain, pits lined with plaster-stored seeds for the next season. Animal bones, gazelle, wild cattle, onager, were tossed into corners, reminders of a still half-wild diet. Children played by the water's edge, where reeds hid the nests of birds. The smell of smoke, grass, and wet clay hung in the air. They didn't yet build walls or towers. Those would come later. But they were already bound by something invisible. Cooperation. To dig storage pits, to protect the spring, to share the hunt, people needed to act together. Jericho was becoming more than a camp. It was becoming a community. From this moment on, humanity's story would never return to its earlier rhythm. Sedentary life changed everything. It meant waste and abundance, conflict and continuity. It meant ancestors who remained in the same soil generation after generation. Beneath every new floor lay the bones of the old. Each layer, another voice whispering, "Stay." In later millennia, when archaeologists sliced through the tell with their spades, they saw these centuries stacked like pages: charcoal, ash, plaster, earth, each a trace of the people who had once walked here. To read the mound was to read the slow awakening of civilization. The deeper they dug, the older the story became. At first they expected pottery, but there was none. The people of early Jericho had not yet learned to shape clay, nor to bake it in fire. They lived in what modern scholars call the pre-ceramic age, when storage was done in baskets and grain was sealed beneath layers of mud. Yet in their absence of invention lay a greater innovation: permanence. It is easy to imagine them at dusk, sitting near the spring, their faces painted with ochre, the light of their fires dancing across the reeds. Perhaps they told stories of the spirits in the hills, or of the great beasts that still roamed the plains to the north. Mammoths had not long vanished. Lions still prowled near the Jordan. The world was younger, but fear and wonder were the same. Somewhere among these gatherings, the first notions of faith may have taken root. They buried their dead beneath the floors of their homes, facing the rising sun. To the living, that may have meant protection, the ancestors guarding the hearth. Or perhaps it was a declaration that life and death shared the same space, that nothing sacred should ever be far from the fire. Generations passed, and the mound grew higher. What began as a seasonal camp became a permanent settlement. With each rebuilding, the layers thickened: stone foundations, hardened floors, and then, in time, walls. By around 10,000 BC, Jericho had transformed from a collection of huts into a true village. Its people no longer followed the herds. The herds came to them. They began to keep goats and sheep, leading them to pasture by day and penning them near the houses at night. It was a simple arrangement, but it required oversight, discipline, and trust. Someone had to count, to guard, to decide when to slaughter and when to breed. Out of necessity, leadership emerged, not kings or priests, but organizers. The first hierarchy in history might have been born beside a watering trough. Still, the world beyond remained wild. Other bands roamed the hills, some friendly, some not. Jericho's people traded obsidian and shells with distant tribes, proof that even at civilization's dawn, connection mattered. The sharp black glass from Anatolia gleamed like mirrors in the desert sun, an early currency of prestige and skill. The oasis became a meeting ground. Stories spread of the fertile spring and the people who had mastered it. New families came, drawn by the promise of food and shelter. The settlement swelled until hundreds, perhaps 1,000, lived within the same few acres. For the first time on Earth, humanity experienced crowding, and with it, cooperation on a scale never seen before. Such growth had its cost. The spring, once generous, began to run low during dry seasons. The fields needed irrigation, the storage pits grew deeper, and competition sharpened. Perhaps this was when the first walls began, as ditches, mere boundaries between homes. Yet from those ditches rose the earliest outlines of the world's first fortifications. But that is another chapter. For now, Jericho still slept in innocence. A place of open fields and soft dawns, where the rhythm of survival matched the rhythm of the spring. The people who lived here could not have known that their quiet experiment would echo across ages, that their huts and hearths would become the foundation of every city that followed. Thousands of years later, when archaeologist Kathleen Kenyon stepped off a plane in 1951 and walked toward the same mound, she stood on the bones of these first settlers. The tell at her feet was not just earth. It was memory made solid. Her spade would cut through 12 millennia of history, each layer whispering the same lesson, that civilization was not invented once, but built over and over in the same sacred soil. In that soil where the spring still flows, the story of Jericho continues. Morning breaks over the valley, as it must have done for 10,000 years. The spring at Ain Sultan still murmurs through the reeds, the same silver thread that first drew people here when the world was young. The hill above it, now a quiet rise of dust and stone, was once alive with voices. They are gone, but what they left behind remains. A faint geometry in the soil, the ghost lines of walls, the bones of fires. Through these traces, their world still speaks. The first dwellers of Jericho were builders before they were farmers. Their hands shaped mud, not metal. Their strength raised circles of earth long before anyone had a reason to call them houses. The remains show foundations pressed into the ground like shallow bowls, the floors smoothed with clay, the roofs woven from brush and reeds. They stood close together, forming a loose ring around a central open space where work and ritual shared the same air. This was the seed of a town, simple, fragile, yet deliberate. Imagine a morning there, smoke curling above the roofs, the smell of damp grain and ash. People moved from hearth to hearth, carrying baskets of wild barley, chatting softly as they ground the kernels to powder. Water jugs filled at the spring glistened in the light. Children chased each other between huts, their laughter rising above the hum of work. To live here was to belong to something larger than the family. Each task linked one hand to another. The spring was everything. It fed their crops, cooled their bodies, gave them reason to return. They might not have understood the mechanics of underground aquifers or seasonal rainfall, yet they knew that this oasis endured while others vanished. So they treated it as sacred ground. Around it, the land was shaped into terraces for planting, low walls of stone keeping the soil from washing away. Over time, the scrub and grass turned into orderly fields, a quiet revolution that changed human life forever. There were no rulers, no armies, no temples, only the rhythm of survival. But even in that rhythm, hints of order appeared. Some families stored grain in sealed pits, others in jars molded from sun-baked clay. Some kept more, some less. Perhaps those who managed storage became decision-makers. Perhaps respect was earned by wisdom, not strength. Jericho's first hierarchy was likely not born from conquest, but from competence. Still, there was something deeper binding them than mere need. The remains of their hearths, carefully rebuilt generation after generation, suggest a sense of continuity, of belonging to the same soil. Beneath those floors, the dead rested, skulls placed beneath thresholds, bodies curled like sleepers. It was as though each dwelling carried its lineage within it, each new house growing from the bones of the old. The people of early Jericho were not alone in this awakening. Across the Fertile Crescent, others were experimenting with permanence. At Beda in the south, at Muribit along the Euphrates, but none matched the scale or persistence found here. The oasis drew them like a heartbeat. Some came to trade obsidian or shells, others perhaps to marry or learn new ways of building. In this web of contact, the idea of settlement spread, a quiet contagion of civilization. The huts themselves changed as the generations passed. The circular forms grew larger, more stable, and their floors hardened to white plaster. The surfaces were polished to a faint shine, almost like marble, a sign that people began to care not only for function, but for beauty. In some rooms, traces of red pigment stain the walls, perhaps decoration, perhaps symbol. These details reveal something new in the human spirit. Pride in place. Everywhere, the same pattern repeated. Construction, collapse, rebuilding, each layer resting on the memory of another. The tell at Jericho, viewed from above, is a monument not to kings, but to persistence. The very act of staying became its architecture. When storms swept through the valley, they must have gathered in the central space, reinforcing the roofs, Shbala repairing the drainage channels. Cooperation wasn't a virtue, it was survival. One family could not keep the spring clear alone, nor could they guard the granaries or the crops without others. From this dependence grew trust, and from trust, a society. At night, after the work was done, fires flickered in the courtyards. They might have sung or told stories of spirits dwelling in the water, of ancestors who watched from beneath the floors. Perhaps they danced in the torchlight, stamping patterns into the dust that echoed the pulse of the spring. Those moments, shared by hundreds, were the first collective rituals of humankind. Yet for all its harmony, early Jericho was also a place of tension. To live close meant to negotiate space, to share, to yield. Disputes must have arisen over grain, water, or the spoils of the hunt. There were no written laws to settle them, only memory and persuasion. But out of such disputes, the idea of mediation was born. The first cities were not built only with mud and stone. They were held together by conversation. As seasons turned to centuries, the settlement grew denser. The huts gave way to sturdier homes, some raised on low stone foundations, others expanded with side rooms for storage or animals. There is a sense, even in the silence of these ruins, that life was thriving, diverse, messy, alive. Small ornaments of bone and shell appear among the remains. Pendants, beads, tools of care and pride. These were no longer transient people. They were rooted and they wanted to remember. It is tempting to think of progress as a sudden spark, but Jericho shows that civilization began as a slow burn. Nothing here seems planned. It evolved. The same spring that fed their fields also eroded their walls, forcing them to rebuild again and again. In that repetition lay learning, and in learning, identity. The people who once wandered began to see themselves as belonging to a place that belonged to them in return. The valley rewarded and punished them in equal measure. In flood seasons, the plains turned to marsh. In dry years, the air cracked with heat. Each hardship taught resilience. They adapted, not by fleeing, but by inventing. Drainage ditches, stronger walls, elevated floors. They became engineers without knowing the word. By the end of this age, Jericho had outgrown its origins as a camp. Its population may have numbered in the hundreds, perhaps more. Crops were no longer gathered by hand alone. Fields stretched outward, bounded by low fences of stone. The rhythm of the wild gave way to the rhythm of the sown. But with growth came unease. To store food was to invite envy. To stay put was to be seen. Somewhere beyond the hills, other groups watched, curious or jealous. The builders of Jericho may have sensed it, the need to define where their world ended and the wilderness began. The idea of a wall, still distant, had already taken shape in their minds. The people here could never have imagined that their small circle of huts would one day be called the first city. To them, it was only home, a place where fire met water, where the dead slept beneath the living, where the past and future shared the same ground. Today, standing on the quiet mound that hides their memory, one can almost feel that continuity. The wind moving across the valley carries the same dry scent of grain and dust. The spring still whispers under the sun. Everything else, the tools, the houses, even the people, has long since turned to powder. Yet the idea they created endures, that humans could choose to belong to the earth, not just pass through it. The valley woke each morning to the shimmer of heat, the sound of the spring, and the steady hum of work. By now, the people of Jericho had lived here for generations, long enough that memory blurred into tradition. Children no longer knew the wandering life. To them, the world was the space between the water and the hills. The first settlements were not monuments of stone or order, but of habit. Every action was repetition turned sacred. What the remains suggest is remarkable. Not only the endurance of life, but its organization. Houses clustered around courtyards where families met to grind grain, prepare food, or dry reeds for new roofs. Along the edges, shallow pits lined with plaster held the year's harvest. Some were sealed with clay lids. Others, perhaps, belonged to the community. It is from these patterns that we glimpse the beginnings of shared labor, the slow evolution of we. The daily rhythm must have been gentle yet constant. At dawn, men and women walked to the plots where wild barley had been encouraged to grow thicker, taller. The tools they carried were primitive, flint sickles and baskets woven from grass, but they used them with mastery. By midday, they would return, the baskets heavy, their bodies streaked with dust. Evenings brought the same ritual, grinding, baking, storing. The scent of grain filled the air. Animals roamed near the settlement, sheep, goats, wild cattle. Some were hunted, others penned. The difference between tame and wild blurred. It is here, perhaps, that the first partnerships between humans and beasts began. Food in exchange for obedience, protection for proximity. From such quiet arrangements, the foundations of pastoral life emerged. In later ages, myths would speak of gods teaching men to farm, to herd, to build. But at Jericho, these miracles had no divine teacher. They came from observation, from patience, from need. Civilization was born not in revelation, but in repetition. When the seasons grew harsh, they turned to their dead. The buried skulls beneath the floors are more than superstition. They are memory made tangible. Each home carried its lineage within its walls, the ancestors resting below, the living above. These acts were both reverence and reassurance, proof that the ground could be trusted. Even in death, the bond to place remained unbroken. Over the centuries, their world expanded. Paths formed between clusters of homes, pressed by bare feet until they became lanes. The courtyards widened, the huts grew larger, their walls reinforced with thicker clay. What began as chance became craft. The early builders of Jericho learned that earth could be shaped to endure. They experimented with lime plaster, smoothing it over floors until it gleamed pale under the sun. It was not yet art, but it was intention, and that distinction marked a turning point in human history. Among the most haunting traces are fragments of red pigment brushed across these plastered surfaces. The meaning is lost, but the impulse is clear. A desire to transform living space into something more than shelter. Perhaps the color represented life, or blood, or the warmth of fire. Whatever its purpose, it was the first attempt to make the home itself a canvas, a place not only of safety, but of meaning. Life in Jericho followed the rhythm of the spring. During the rains, the valley overflowed, and the fields sparkled green. In drought, the earth cracked, and the air turned brittle. The people adapted, deepening their channels, raising the ground where they built. In this constant dialogue between land and labor, intelligence sharpened. They read the soil as one might read the sky, learning that endurance required balance. It was this awareness that prepared them for the next transformation. The settlement, once a circle of huts, was growing too large to remain open. Crops needed guarding, stores needed watching, and the spring itself needed protection from flood and erosion. So they began to shape the landscape in ways unseen before. They cut trenches and heaped the soil into ridges, creating boundaries that were both practical and symbolic. In time, those boundaries became walls, not the towering defenses of later empires, but low encircling structures built from stone and mud, tracing the settlement like a second skin. Some scholars see in them the earliest hint of fear, of others, of scarcity, of loss. Yet they may have been built as much for the earth as against it, to hold back the rush of seasonal floods that threaten their homes each spring. Protection, in either case, required cooperation. To raise a wall was to unite. With each new generation, the settlement became more intricate. The older dwellings were leveled, their remains packed into the foundations of the new. From above, Jericho might have resembled a series of concentric rings, homes surrounding open spaces surrounding the lifeline of the spring. It was a design born not of planning, but of instinct, a layout repeated unconsciously across centuries. To live here was to belong to something that outlasted memory. The oldest elders might have recalled when their ancestors still followed herds through the plains, but their children knew only this place, the warmth of its soil, the shimmer of the water, the sound of voices echoing between earthen walls. It was continuity made visible, and yet, amidst all this permanence, life remained fragile. Fire, flood, disease, any could unravel what they had built. But even in ruin, the instinct was not to leave. They rebuilt atop the ashes, layer upon layer, the earth itself recording each attempt. That persistence, the refusal to move on, is what made Jericho unique. Others settled. Jericho endured. Centuries later, when later inhabitants raised new walls and the famous tower, they would still be standing on this same foundation of habit and hope. The people of 9000 BC laid more than clay and stone. They laid a pattern for every city that would follow. A heart around water, a circle around that heart, and a story that grew from both. Even now, looking across the valley, one can sense what drew them here. The spring still gleams in the sunlight, the same faint line of green against the desert gold. It doesn't take imagination to picture the first dwellers moving between their huts, carrying water, laughing, living. They did not know they were making history. They only wanted tomorrow to look like today. The earliest builders of Jericho left no inscriptions, no songs we can hear, yet the ground itself holds their testament. Beneath each layer of dust lies a decision: to stay, to rebuild, to remain faithful to a place that had never abandoned them. That, more than any wall or tower, is their true creation. The first civilization not of power, but of patience. Soon they would build higher. The simple huts would give way to heavier structures. The walls would rise, and the tower, still centuries away, would pierce the dawn. But all of that began here, in the hush before the first stone was lifted. Jericho's beginnings were humble, but its endurance was absolute. Across the long curve of the valley, the sound of water had not changed, but the world around it had. The spring still shimmered beneath the cliffs, yet what surrounded it was no longer the village of mud and reed it had once been. Generations had come and gone since the first wall was raised, and Jericho, though built from the same soil, had turned into something altogether new. From above, the settlement must have looked like a patchwork of pale rectangles pressed into the earth. The round huts of the past had vanished. In their place stood sturdy, angular homes, aligned in deliberate rows, their corners sharp, their roofs flat. The age of improvisation was over. Geometry had entered human life. Inside these new houses, plaster floors gleamed faintly under the morning sun. Walls were painted with ochre and lime, and storage bins lined the corners. In one room, the remains of a hearth still bear the blackened marks of long use. In another, the faint outline of a reed mat is preserved in dust. Each space tells the same story. A people who no longer survived by the season, but by the rhythm of habit, record, and repair. With the passing centuries, farming had become the pulse of everything. Wheat and barley dominated the fields. Lentils and peas filled the clay jars stacked in cool, shadowed rooms. Herds of goats grazed along the slopes, their bells ringing faintly through the dawn haze. The wild had retreated. Life had become deliberate, ordered, predictable, and in that order, powerful. But such stability came at a price. The more the city produced, the more it required control. Someone had to decide when to plant, when to harvest, how to divide the grain. The simple cooperation that had once built the tower now turned into administration. Leadership, once an act of trust, was becoming an office. Everywhere the evidence points to the same slow turning, from community to hierarchy, from collective effort to structure. Yet even amid this change, something profoundly human remained. In one of the dwellings, archaeologists found a cluster of plastered skulls, arranged carefully in a niche, faces molded by hand, eyes inlaid with shells from the sea. The gesture was not decorative, it was devotion. These were ancestors, remembered through touch. The people of Jericho were learning to shape memory as they had once shaped clay. To live here during those centuries was to walk a narrow line between the sacred and the practical. Daily life was simple. Dawn began with the grind of stone on grain, the thud of tools shaping bone and flint. Midday brought silence, the city resting under the heat, its people sheltering in the shade of mud brick walls. Evening stirred movement again. Fires lit, voices rising, bread baking in open pits. Children played along the narrow lanes. Smoke rose from rooftops into the darkening sky. Civilization was no longer an experiment. It had become routine. Beyond the city walls, the world was widening. Traders came from the north bearing obsidian and turquoise, their roots stretching toward Anatolia and the Mediterranean shores. From the south came seashells and salt. From the east, fine pigments ground from stone. In return, Jericho offered grain, tools, and the knowledge of cultivation itself. The settlement had become a hub, a fixed point in a web that now spanned the Fertile Crescent. Every exchange carried more than goods. It carried ideas, stories, beliefs. The concept of the sacred tower, of the earth as a mother and the harvest as her gift, echoed across regions. Others built shrines and raised images of fertility, figurines of women with wide hips and calm faces, their forms mirroring the abundance of the fields. Whether the people of Jericho still worshipped such figures is uncertain, but the thought of continuity lingers, the sense that the earth itself remained divine. Within the walls, social life was evolving. Families grew larger, households expanded, and crafts began to specialize. Some worked in plaster, repairing walls and floors. Others shaped flint, creating blades sharper than bone. A few may have been dedicated to ritual, the caretakers of the dead, the keepers of stories. The city's unity was no longer built only on shared survival, but on shared function. That unity, however, was showing strain. The new architecture, the shift from circles to rectangles, was more than aesthetic. It reflected a deeper change in thought. The old round houses, where families had gathered together around central hearths, suggested equality and shared space. The new ones, divided into corners and corridors, separated private from communal life. Ownership had entered the design. Perhaps this was when the first notions of wealth appeared, not coins or jewels, but storage, whose grain lasted through the dry season, whose herds grew larger, whose home was repaired with finer plaster. Power was beginning to take form in silence, not yet written, but already understood. Still, the city thrived. In the evenings, songs echoed across the valley as feasts were held after the harvest. Fires burned bright on rooftops, the scent of bread mixing with smoke. The people of Jericho had not forgotten how to celebrate. Rituals tied them together, dances, offerings, communal meals that turned survival into gratitude. Beneath these gatherings lay the same instinct that had driven the first builders, to belong to something greater than oneself. Time, however, was not standing still. The same walls that had once represented safety were beginning to define separation. As the settlement grew denser, the open courtyards vanished, replaced by narrow alleys. Light reached the streets only in strips. Air moved through the city like breath through a reed. With population came pressure, more mouths to feed, less space to live. The strain is visible even in the ruins. Floors were repaired again and again, sometimes over earlier walls, sometimes over graves. The tell thickened, its layers compressing centuries into meters, each generation quite literally built on the bones of the last. The ancestors were still there, but perhaps their voices had grown faint. Jericho's people had achieved something unimaginable. They had bent nature to their will, but they now faced the quiet burden of success. Stability, once a miracle, had become expectation. An expectation demanded more. Larger harvests, stronger walls, greater security. The balance between harmony and control grew fragile. Yet even at its most complex, life here remained personal. The city was not faceless. It breathed through the work of its citizens. A woman repairing a hearth might hum the same tune her grandmother once sang. A boy herding goats at the edge of the fields might pass the tower each morning and touch its base for luck. The stones themselves had become a language of continuity. By 6000 BC, Jericho had reached the height of its Neolithic glory. Its fields stretched wide. Its population may have reached into the thousands. The walls stood strong against flood and time. Trade routes converged on its gates. But under the surface of its success, Quiet transformations were stirring, signs that permanence, for all its beauty, could not last forever. Each civilization, however small, carries the shadow of its decline. The soil that once gave abundantly was beginning to tire. The spring, though still flowing, could not alone sustain the growing demand. As resources thinned, unity strained. The first murmurs of division stirred through the city, disputes over water, over land, over privilege. Jericho, the first home, was beginning to learn what every city after it would face, that greatness is never free, and that the price of endurance is change. In the stillness of early dawn, Jericho gleamed pale beneath the sun. The walls that once marked safety now cast long shadows across the plain, dividing field from desert, order from wilderness. Inside that boundary, the city had grown intricate, no longer a settlement of survival, but a machine of daily rhythm and purpose. By this age, the builders of Jericho had perfected the art of permanence. Their houses stood firm on stone foundations, their walls hardened with lime and clay. Many bore 2 stories, an innovation born from necessity rather than vanity. The flat rooftops served as workspaces, sleeping places, and watch points over the distant fields. From above, the city looked alive even in silence, smoke rising from hearths, shadows moving between courtyards, livestock bleating from pens along the outer edge. The days revolved around labor. At sunrise, men and women carried baskets of grain and tools out through narrow gates, following the familiar paths that led to the fields. The soil beyond the walls had been turned by generations of hands, rich with silt and ash. There, under the widening heat, they reaped barley and wheat, bending and straightening in the rhythm of the blade. When the wind shifted, dust lifted into gold, and the sound of their work became a single pulse across the valley. Within the walls, other crafts filled the hours. Flint was knapped into blades and arrowheads. Bone was polished into needles and ornaments. The air inside the dwellings often smelled of plaster and ash, the scent of repair. Women ground grain on heavy stones, their movements steady and practiced, while children fetched water from the spring. Life was measured not by conquest or war, but by repetition, the slow accumulation of routine that kept the city alive. Yet repetition can be deceptive. Beneath the quiet surface, Jericho was changing in ways that could not yet be named. The city had become too successful, too stable. Abundance breeds difference, and difference seeks form. In the older ages, every house had looked much the same. Now some were broader, better built, their walls smoother, their floors polished with fine plaster. A few stood closer to the spring, where the air was cooler and the ground fertile. Others crowded near the wall, their rooms smaller, their light dim. Wealth, once invisible, had found shape in architecture. This new hierarchy was subtle. No palaces, no slaves, but its roots were there. Some families stored more grain than others. Some had tools of better stone. Perhaps they had more hands to work their land, or better access to trade. Perhaps their ancestors had held some unspoken authority since the building of the first tower. Whatever its cause, the balance that had once bound Jericho in equality had begun to tilt. Still, the city's faith endured. Beneath the floors of many houses, the custom of burial continued, but it had evolved. Instead of single skulls placed in isolation, clusters of them appeared. Whole groups arranged together, the faces molded and painted. It was as though families were no longer just remembering the dead, but claiming them. Ancestors had become symbols of legacy, the silent guardians of property and status. At certain times of year, the people likely gathered for ceremony. In the open courts, they prepared offerings of grain and fruit, perhaps even of animals. Firelight would have danced against the plastered walls as drums echoed through the night. The rituals that once united them in gratitude now reinforced belonging. Who had a seat by the flame, who did not. Even in reverence, hierarchy had found its way in. Trade continued to weave Jericho into the fabric of the wider world. Obsidian from Anatolia, shells from the Red Sea, and rare pigments arrived along the ancient paths that crossed the Fertile Crescent. The people of the city were no longer isolated. They knew of others who built and sowed, who prayed and bartered under the same sun. But Jericho remained singular in its endurance, a city of builders who had mastered the rhythm of continuity. Each new layer of the tell carried the imprint of these lives, plastered floors upon plastered floors, rising like the pages of an unfinished book. The ground beneath each home was both foundation and graveyard. In time, the living walked several meters above the world of their ancestors. They were literally elevated by their own history. Perhaps they felt it, the weight of time pressing upward from beneath their feet. Each generation built higher, but also closer to the limits of what the land could give. Soil tired, fields stretched farther from the spring. The delicate balance that had sustained the city for centuries was beginning to fray. Seasons grew less predictable. The rains sometimes failed. The harvests thinned. What had once seemed eternal began to falter. The walls, too, required constant repair. Cracks opened under the pressure of age and flood. Still, the people rebuilt as they always had, patching, reinforcing, layering their persistence into the earth. In this persistence lay both strength and fragility. The same stubbornness that had allowed Jericho to thrive could not protect it from the slow exhaustion of its surroundings. Trade might fill the storerooms for a time, but no caravan could replace what the valley itself was losing. And so, without battle or fire, decline began its quiet work. It likely came softly. Fewer children, smaller harvests, fields left fallow too long. Families moved away, perhaps to richer valleys farther north, leaving their houses to crumble in the heat. The spring continued to flow, indifferent. The walls that had once held life together became empty shells, their plaster flaking under sun and wind. Yet even in ruin, Jericho remained inhabited by memory. For those who stayed, the city must have seemed eternal, a place too old to die. They still repaired the walls, still buried their dead beneath the floors, still watched the tower's shadow stretch across the plain. But the rhythm had slowed, and silence began to settle between the stones. Centuries later, when new settlers arrived, they found the traces of a civilization that had already lived 1,000 lifetimes. Beneath their feet lay not the story of a single people, but of humanity itself learning and forgetting how to build a world. Jericho's greatness was never measured in size or splendor. Its achievement lay in something smaller, quieter, but more enduring. The discovery that permanence was possible, that human hands could shape time itself. Every wall, every floor, every plastered face was an answer to the same unspoken question. How long can we stay? The answer, as it turned out, was both infinite and fleeting. For even the first city could not escape the cycle it had set in motion. Growth, mastery, exhaustion, renewal. The people who once walked its alleys had no notion of legacy, no thought of history. They only knew that to live was to build, and to build was to belong. The spring still runs where they once drank. The air still smells of dust and stone. And somewhere beneath the tell, beneath the 1,000 layers of effort and faith, their city still sleeps, a monument not to conquest, but to continuity. Dawn spread across the valley like a slow unveiling, the first light touching the rim of the tell and tracing its contours in gold. Where once had stood circles of clay huts, there now rose something altogether new. Walls, broad, deliberate, and enduring. They surrounded the heart of the settlement like a great hand cupped around a flame. Jericho had changed. No longer a loose gathering of families beside a spring, it had become a living structure, planned and layered, its boundaries visible even from afar. The walls of Jericho were not decoration. They were intention made solid, an act of collective will that separated the world within from the world without. When the wind shifted, it carried the sounds of building, the rhythm of stone on stone, the low murmur of command, the sigh of dust. Across the centuries, these echoes remain. Beneath the soil, archaeologists would one day find traces of this transformation. Foundations of limestone blocks, packed earth, and mud bricks sealed with lime. To the people who raised them, this was not construction. It was creation. Their world was changing fast. The Neolithic Revolution, though no one could name it then, had taken hold. Fields stretched farther into the plain, no longer the scattered plots of experiment, but organized tracts of cultivation. Grains were sown, harvested, and replanted in rhythm with the sun. Goats and sheep, once half-wild companions, now lived within the settlement's edge, their hooves beating time to the pulse of the people who tended them. The walls were the natural outcome of this abundance. Prosperity demanded protection. A community that could feed itself could also be envied. Jericho's wall, however, was more than a barrier. It was a declaration that humanity had mastered permanence. For the first time, the earth itself was not simply inhabited. It was shaped to human design. The structure was astonishing. Its base, made of stone, encircled the settlement in an unbroken ring, stretching hundreds of meters. It rose several meters high and several thick, broad enough to resist the floods that rolled from the hills each spring, and perhaps, though none can say for certain, to mark a symbolic threshold between safety and wilderness. Inside this circle, life hummed with a new complexity. The old round huts gave way to sturdier constructions, their walls reinforced, their floors polished smooth. Pathways wound between them, connecting storehouses, workspaces, and gathering courts. The air smelled of lime, ash, and grain. Each morning brought the scrape of millstones, the bray of penned animals, the chatter of markets in miniature. At the center stood something still more remarkable, a tower, broad at the base and narrowing toward the sky. Its core was filled with packed earth and stone, and within it, a spiral of steps climbed upward into the light. To see it rise from the valley floor must have been a sight beyond imagining, the first monument built by human hands on such a scale. The Tower of Jericho was not a whim. It was a vision given form. Whether it was raised to watch the horizon, to mark the sun's course, or to serve as a meeting place for the divine and mortal, we cannot know. What is certain is that it required something unprecedented: organization. The labor of many hundreds over many months. Builders, planners, carriers, diggers, all working to a single purpose. In that purpose lay the seed of civilization's greatest invention: coordination. This was no longer the cooperation of hunters sharing a kill, or families building homes side by side. This was leadership, collective intent channeled through design. The wall and the tower were the first visible proof that people could act as one body, guided by a single mind. The thought of it still astonishes. Thousands of years before the first city-states, before writing, before metal or pottery, the people of Jericho gathered beneath the same sun to raise stone against the sky. They had no written plans, no architects, no engineers, only memory, intuition, and sheer determination. What drove them? Fear, perhaps, of floods, of outsiders, of hunger. But fear alone could not have built the tower. There must have been vision, something or someone who could persuade others that this was worth the toil. Some believe it was religion, that the structure stood as a shrine, its steps spiraling toward the heavens, a bridge between earth and sky. Others think it was practical, an early observatory to track the seasons and the turning of the sun. The truth may lie somewhere in between, a merging of necessity and reverence. For the builders, the distinction likely did not exist. To build was sacred. To shape the earth was an act of faith. The tower cast its shadow across the valley as the sun climbed each day. Perhaps people gathered beneath it during rituals, offering grain or water to unseen powers. Perhaps the elders climbed its steps at dusk to look out across the plain, measuring the floods, reading the weather, or watching for strangers. Whatever its use, its presence transformed Jericho. It became a place of identity, a community with a center, a heartbeat. Within the walls, life grew intricate. Clay bins held grain in measured amounts, and with surplus came exchange. Tools and goods passed from hand to hand. Some worked flint, others plaster or bone. There were those who hunted still, and those who tended the fields, those who shaped, those who taught. Labor divided, yet purpose united. At night, fires glowed along the wall's inner rim. From above, the settlement must have looked like a constellation, each ember a point of light in a man-made galaxy. For those who lived there, the world beyond the wall was dark, uncertain. Within, there was rhythm, safety, the steady murmur of life continuing. Even the dead had their place in this design. The old custom of burial beneath the floors endured. New skulls, plastered and painted, were arranged in shallow pits, their eyes crafted from shells that caught the flicker of firelight. The living walked above them daily, children playing, women grinding grain, men carrying loads of stone. In this layered world, the boundary between past and present was as thin as a floor of clay. But the wall, for all its grandeur, did not end change. It invited it. The act of building awakened new desires, to improve, to expand, to leave a mark that would last. Over time, Jericho's walls would collapse and rise again, stronger, broader, more ambitious. Each rebuilding was not simply repair, it was reinvention. The settlement now covered several acres, a scale unseen anywhere else in the world. For the first time, population density demanded planning. Paths to manage movement, storage to handle surplus, systems to share water. The city, though no one yet used the word, was being born. Still, the essence of life here remained human, intimate. Mothers sang to infants in the shade of the tower. Young men repaired ditches and built ovens. Elders told stories of the first arrival at the spring. Beneath the innovation lay continuity. The same spring still flowed, the same hills framed the horizon. Civilization did not erupt, it accumulated, and nowhere on earth is that accumulation clearer than in Jericho, the first place where human intention outlived its makers. The wall and tower did not merely protect or define, they announced that humankind had crossed a threshold. From this moment on, nature was no longer the sole architect. If the hunter's age was about following the world, Jericho's was about shaping it. The hands that once scattered seeds now molded mountains. The voice that once called across the plain now echoed against walls of its own making. When the sun set over the tower, casting its shadow across the green ribbon of the valley, those who stood at its base could look up and see what no human eyes had seen before, their own endurance rising toward the sky. As the tower first stood complete, it must have caught the dawn like a blade of stone. Light touched its peak before it reached the valley floor, and for the people gathered below, that single moment would have seemed divine. For the first time in history, humankind had built something taller than itself, something that would outlast its builders. What purpose it served has long been lost, though the earth still remembers its base. A ring of stones broad enough for 10 men to stand abreast. It rose from the heart of the settlement like a promise. Some have said it was a fortress, raised in fear of strangers or beasts. Others imagine it as a watchtower for floods, a bulwark against the restless waters that sometimes rush down from the hills. And there are those who sense in it the echo of ritual, the idea that the tower was not protection, but prayer, a way of reaching skyward toward unseen gods. Perhaps it was all of these things. For the people of early Jericho, the sacred and the practical were never separate. To build was to worship. To plan was to honor the forces that kept them alive. The tower and its surrounding wall were not merely stone. They were faith made visible, an attempt to give permanence to gratitude and fear alike. Inside those walls, daily life carried on in patterns that were by then as old as memory. The same round houses huddled together, though now they pressed closer, constrained by the growing settlement. Narrow passages wound between them, worn smooth by years of bare feet. Smoke drifted through the air, mingled with the faint smell of lime plaster and ash. Chickens did not yet exist, but flocks of goats and sheep bleated nearby, their bells of bone and clay marking the hours. The people rose with the sun and worked until its heat became unbearable. Fields outside the wall shimmered in the distance, green patches on a brown plain. Women pounded grain in rhythm with the day's breath. Men repaired the ditches that carried the spring water to the crops. Theirs was not a life of ease, yet compared to the endless wandering of their ancestors, it must have felt like paradise, a home secured by their own invention. In the evenings, when the light softened, the tower's shadow stretched across the valley, a sundial for a world that had not yet learned to count time. Children must have played in its shadow, running circles around its base, while their elders rested beside the wall. From its top, the horizon was vast, the faint glimmer of the Dead Sea to the east, the long line of the hills fading westward. To stand there was to see everything, to feel the earth mastered, if only for a moment. But even paradise needs order. The scale of construction, the gathering of stone and clay, demanded more than cooperation. It demanded leadership. Somewhere within the settlement, voices began to carry authority. Perhaps it was an elder who organized the builders, or a shaman who claimed to speak for the gods who watched from the sky. Whatever form it took, power had entered human life. It would not yet resemble the kingship of later ages. There were no crowns, no palaces, no armies, only influence, born of wisdom or charisma, reinforced by ritual. Yet the signs were there, a new respect for command, a willingness to follow. To raise walls of that size required not only muscle, but obedience. For the first time, hierarchy had a home. That shift was subtle but irreversible. The wall itself became a symbol of belonging. To live within it was to be part of the whole. To live outside was to be other. The first line between us and them had been drawn, not yet in blood, but in stone. Still, the spirit of unity was stronger than division. The wall protected not only their fields and herds, but also the fragile idea of community. It allowed them to store food through lean seasons, to celebrate together after harvests, to plan for the future. Within its circle, time had continuity. What remains of that continuity lies, buried now, plastered floors repaired dozens of times, each new layer laid directly atop the old. The people of Jericho never erased their past. They built upon it. When a wall crumbled, it was reinforced. When a house fell, another rose on the same ground. The tell itself is the record of this persistence, a mountain of memory formed one generation at a time. Among those memories, traces of ritual still linger. Beneath the clay floors, skulls rest with faces sculpted anew, noses shaped from plaster, shells pressed where eyes once were. Each one is different, each one personal. The living must have known these faces intimately. They shaped them from recollection, not imagination. It was a way to keep the dead among them, to ensure the ancestors never drifted too far. To later ages, these plastered skulls would seem eerie, but to the people of Jericho, they were comfort, proof that the bond between the living and the dead was unbroken. When families gathered at night, their ancestors quite literally lay beneath their feet. In that sense, the tower above and the graves below formed a single design. The world of humans stretched between heaven and earth, connected by memory and stone. It is impossible to say how they explained the meaning of these acts. Perhaps they believed that the ancestors guarded the walls, or that the tower guided spirits upward toward the light. Maybe they saw in every structure the same truth that we still chase, that the things we build outlive us, and so they must hold our essence. For centuries, the people of Jericho thrived in this balance of work and faith. The wall withstood floods. The tower stood firm through seasons of wind and drought. The settlement grew denser, its people more skilled. Stone tools sharpened, dwellings improved, and the rhythm of the community deepened. Theirs was a civilization in miniature. No kings, no armies, but a society nonetheless, bound by routine and reverence. Yet progress is never still. The very success that allowed Jericho to flourish carried within it the seeds of change. As families multiplied, the space within the walls grew crowded. Fields beyond had to stretch farther each year, and with distance came vulnerability. Strangers, too, began to pass through the valley. Traders, wanderers, perhaps refugees from drier lands. Contact brought exchange, but also tension. The same walls that protected could also divide. One can imagine arguments echoing in the courtyards. How high the walls should be, who should guard the fields, who would store the grain. Power, once shared, began to concentrate. Perhaps the elders convened beneath the tower to decide, their voices rising in debate as the wind hissed through the reeds. Jericho was learning what every city after it would, that permanence invites politics. Even so, its foundations held. For another 1,000 years, the wall and tower remained at the heart of life. Generations were born in their shadow and buried beneath their floors. The structure endured until erosion and time reclaimed it, until floods ate at its base and the stone gave way. But by then, its work was done. It had taught humanity the shape of community. When the walls finally fell, the idea they represented did not. Others would follow. Çatalhöyük, Eridu, Uruk, each raising their own circles of stone and mud in imitation of this first experiment. But none would be as pure, as close to the moment when humans first looked upon their own creation. and realized it was larger than themselves. The tower may have crumbled, its steps buried beneath millennia of dust, yet its presence lingers in every city skyline that followed. It was not a monument to power, but to unity, to the will of ordinary hands, guided by a shared dream. And somewhere in that dream, the world as we know it began. The people of Jericho could never have guessed that their work would echo across ages. They built because they needed to, because the floods came and the crops mattered and the gods were silent. But in doing so, they gave humanity its first true symbol of belonging, a wall to define home and a tower to remember why it was worth defending. And as the sun once more touched the summit of that tower, gilding the stones in light, they must have felt, if only for a breath, that they had touched something eternal. The walls that had once gleamed under the valley sun now stood silent, their plaster dulled by centuries of dust. Jericho's rhythm, once steady as breath, faltered. Grain bins lay empty, and the courtyards that had echoed with the sound of grinding stones filled instead with wind. The spring still flowed. It always had, but the people were leaving. No one recorded why. There are no texts, no laments etched into clay, no final gesture of farewell. Only the layers of silence in the earth, collapsed walls, broken tools, the absence of fire ash where it should have been. The city that had outlasted flood and famine, that had built and rebuilt itself for centuries, simply thinned until its pulse was gone. It may have begun with the soil. For generations, the same fields had yielded their bounty, and the same floodwaters had replenished them. But the balance between gift and demand is delicate. When the rains grew sparse and the river's rhythm shifted, the land could no longer heal between harvests. Dust replaced abundance. The same spring that had once drawn thousands could now only sustain a few. Perhaps it was not famine, but fatigue. A society built on constant rebuilding eventually tires. Each generation had raised its walls higher, had mended cracks, had watched their city swell and strain. When the earth failed them, perhaps they simply stopped. There is a quiet kind of ending that requires no catastrophe, only the decision to leave. Even in departure, they left their mark. Before they walked away, they buried their dead one last time, sealing them beneath floors that would never again be swept clean. The final houses were left half-finished, the walls already leaning. Time, as always, continued its work. Winds blew in from the desert, carrying dust that softened every edge. The city that had once defied nature was finally reclaimed by it. Centuries passed. The tell lay still beneath the sky, a low rise covered in wild grass and thorn. Yet the spring kept running, a thread of life winding through desolation. Animals came to drink, birds nested in the reeds. The world moved on. Elsewhere, new communities were rising. The first villages of the Chalcolithic age, where stone tools gleamed alongside copper blades. In the north, people were learning to shape metal. In the south, trade routes thickened with salt and wool. But here, where the first walls had stood, the silence held. Then, slowly, life returned. At first, it was scattered. A few families camping near the water, small fires flickering in the same wind that once blew through the city gates. They came seasonally, leaving in the heat, returning when the valley cooled. Their traces are faint, bits of pottery, broken hearthstones, animal bones charred by flame, but enough to show that Jericho had not been forgotten. Perhaps its mound, rising like a promise above the plain, still held meaning. The ancestors had lived here. The spring still flowed. That was reason enough. Over time, these seasonal camps thickened into permanence once more. By around 4000 BC, the early echoes of a new world reached the valley. Bronze had not yet come, but copper glinted in the hands of traders who passed along the great routes of the Levant. Villages farther west were experimenting with metallurgy, with organized trade, with ritual art. Change traveled slowly, but it traveled. And when it reached Jericho, the tell stirred again. The new settlers who came found not wilderness, but inheritance. Beneath their feet lay the bones of a city so old that its memory had become myth. They built over it, as their ancestors had before them, mud brick upon mud brick, generation upon generation, as though unaware that they were walking on 12,000 years of memory. Yet their world was different. The landscape of the Near East was transforming. Where once there had been scattered farming villages, now there were networks of exchange. People no longer bartered in isolation. They traded across valleys and seas. The first glimmer of commerce had arrived, and with it, ambition. Jericho's position made it valuable again, an oasis in the heart of the southern Levant, guarding the routes between Egypt, Canaan, and the rising cultures of Mesopotamia. The city that rose from the ruins was smaller at first, humbler, but it bore the same instinct that had shaped its predecessors, to endure. The spring was still its lifeline, the walls still its skeleton. This time, however, those walls were built not from lime and mud alone, but from knowledge, the inheritance of countless rebuildings. The people of the new Jericho, like those before them, faced the same challenges: flood, drought, envy, time. Their tools had changed, but their task had not. Across the centuries that followed, Jericho once again became a place of labor and trade. The houses were simpler, the walls thicker, the settlements more compact. Herds of cattle and goats roamed the nearby slopes. Copper tools flashed in the sunlight. In the surrounding hills, miners dug for malachite, the green stone that promised transformation when melted with fire. Civilization, in its next form, was taking shape. It is tempting to imagine these later settlers aware of what they had inherited, but that is unlikely. The deep past is always invisible to those who live above it. They must have seen the mound as simply good ground, elevated, well-drained, blessed with a spring. Yet their choice to settle here again was no coincidence. The same forces that had drawn their ancestors returned them: water, safety, memory. The story of Jericho was never about invention. It was about recurrence. In this age, walls were raised once more, not as symbols, but as necessity. Conflict had begun to touch even the once quiet valleys. To the north, city-states were emerging, their leaders hungry for land and tribute. Armies were still small, but ambition had learned to march. The fortifications at Jericho, rebuilt again in the late 4th millennium BC, were less ceremonial than those of the past. They were built to withstand siege. The people who lived behind them carried weapons of copper and stone, traded grain and cloth, and buried their dead in pottery coffins instead of beneath the floors. Their rituals had changed, but the impulse to mark the sacred remained. In a world of shifting powers, the oasis of Jericho still shone like an anchor of continuity, a place where life had always been possible. Yet the pattern of renewal carried within it the seeds of another fall. Around 3000 BC, as the Bronze Age dawned, the balance began to tilt once again. Across the Levant, new cities were rising, larger, richer, better defended. Jericho, though still vibrant, was no longer unique. It had competitors now, rivals with greater access to trade and more ambitious rulers. Still, it held fast. The spring continued to feed its fields, and the tell grew higher, with every generation. Beneath each layer of new life, the ruins of the old remained, a dialogue between past and present. To walk through its gates was to walk over time itself. By then, Jericho had been inhabited, abandoned, and reborn more times than anyone could count. It had survived droughts, floods, famine, and silence. Its people had built towers, shaped faces of plaster, and walked away, only to return again centuries later. There is a rhythm in that pattern, a truth that speaks not of greatness, but of endurance. For all its walls, Jericho's true strength was never defense. It was memory, the unbroken thread that bound the living to the soil of their ancestors. Every return was a reaffirmation. This place mattered. This spring endured. This ground was home. By the closing of this era, as copper gave way to bronze and villages became kingdoms, Jericho stood once more among the cities of men. Its walls rose again, its hearths burned anew. The sound of the hammer replaced the silence of wind. Civilization, it seemed, had found its footing again. Yet deep beneath, in the dark strata of the tell, the ghosts of its earliest builders still slept, the first to stay, the first to believe that permanence was possible. Their legacy was not the wall or the tower, but the idea that each ending contains its beginning. And as the first light of a new millennium touched the valley, Jericho, ever patient, ever reborn, breathed again. The sun rose once more over the mound, glinting against the pale rock and the slow shimmer of the oasis. By now, centuries had passed since the Neolithic walls had fallen, but the spring below them never ceased. Life always returned to this place, drawn by the same inexhaustible water that had sustained the first dwellers millennia before. In the early Bronze Age, Jericho was born anew. The people who settled here were heirs to forgotten foundations, farmers, traders, shepherds, perhaps unaware that beneath their feet lay the bones of humanity's first builders. They chose the same ground for the same reasons: fertile soil, sheltering cliffs, and the undying spring that whispered through the reeds. The new city that rose was smaller than its ancient ancestor, but more deliberate. Its walls were rebuilt, this time with a different purpose. The early fortifications of the Neolithic had marked belonging. These were defenses in the truest sense. Stone ramparts circled the settlement, topped by mud brick parapets that glowed red in the heat. For the first time, gates pierced those walls, controlled passages where guards might stand, where trade and danger alike could be measured before entering. Within those walls, life followed the rhythm of a new age. Bronze had not yet reached its height, but copper gleamed in the tools and ornaments of Jericho's people. They carved vessels, hammered blades, and shaped pins of metal soft enough to bend but bright enough to impress. The craft was both art and statement, a new material to express permanence, a reflection of mastery over the earth's hidden fire. The city prospered as trade deepened across the Levant. Caravans wound through the desert trails, carrying obsidian, bitumen, and dried figs. Others came north from Egypt with linen and beads of faience. In exchange, Jericho offered grain, leather, and salt. The spring that once sustained a handful of families now supplied the economy of an entire region. Its oasis, green against the pale desert, was a harbor of life for travelers and merchants. Every evening, the gates closed, sealing the city in quiet hum. Fires flickered from rooftops, and the scent of baked bread drifted over the walls. The people of Jericho lived by pattern, yet the pattern was no longer fragile. It had survived collapse and silence. Now it thrived on memory. This new era did not erase what came before. Beneath the city, the old layers remained, dust and plaster, crumbled towers, the imprints of hearths long cold. The builders of this Bronze Age Jericho could not have known that their every foundation rested on civilizations already 1,000 years dead, but in some sense they must have felt it. The ground itself seemed shaped for settlement, compacted by the lives of those who had once built in the same spot. The mound was not natural, it was the architecture of memory. Within its streets, new voices rose. Artisans worked clay into vessels, etched designs of spirals and birds. Weavers spun thread from flax and wool. Metal workers tended their fires in small workshops along the outer lanes, the air heavy with smoke and copper dust. Life had become specialized, divided by craft and skill. The city was no longer merely a home. It was an organism, sustained by countless parts. But even as it grew more organized, Jericho's heart remained simple. The same spring ran through it, feeding narrow channels that wound between houses. Children splashed in its shallows. Women drew water at dawn, balancing jars against their shoulders. Every generation rediscovered what the first had known, that here, water and endurance were one. The world beyond the valley was changing, too. Across the Fertile Crescent, new centers of power were rising. In Mesopotamia, kings of Uruk carved their names into clay tablets. Along the Nile, the first pharaohs prepared for rule. Compared to these places, Jericho was modest. A small, fortified town, not an empire. Yet its importance lay not in size, but in continuity. While kingdoms rose and fell elsewhere, this oasis remained, as it had since the Ice Age, an unbroken thread of habitation in a world of flux. Travelers who passed through must have felt it, the weight of its stillness, the way the land seemed older than memory. The same stone foundations, the same echo of footsteps on hardened earth. Jericho was not a city chasing glory. It was a city remembering survival. Over time, its modest prosperity grew. By 3000 BC, it had become a regional stronghold. The walls were rebuilt once more, thicker and higher, ringed with ditches that served as both defense and flood control. Watchtowers stood at the corners, their upper floors shaded by woven canopies. From those heights, one could see the glint of other towns on the horizon. Neighbors, rivals, allies. The era of isolation was long over. With trade came influence. The people of Jericho were now part of a network that stretched from the Nile Delta to the Euphrates. Copper ingots, traded across hundreds of miles, arrived here to be worked into tools and ornaments. Terracotta jars from distant lands were found in its dwellings. Language itself began to shift, enriched by foreign words and accents brought by merchants and migrants. The city had become a crossroads once more, a place where the past and future met. And yet, beneath the progress, one truth remained unchanged: the cycle of endurance and decay. The earth that gave also took back. Floods occasionally tore at the lower walls. The spring that sustained the city sometimes overflowed, drowning the fields it once nourished. The people repaired and rebuilt, as they always had, unwilling to abandon what had been theirs since time immemorial. At night, they still told stories. Perhaps the tales were no longer of skulls and spirits, but of heroes, traders, and the gods of weather and harvest. Yet the theme was constant, that life here was a gift, and gifts demanded reverence. The city's faith, though altered by centuries, still revolved around renewal, the belief that even if walls fell, they could rise again. By the end of this age, Jericho had lived through more rebirths than any other place on earth. It had seen the first walls rise from mud, the first tower cast its shadow, the first fields bloom where wilderness once stood. Now it stood as one among many fortified towns of the Bronze Age world, a small kingdom in the cradle of civilization. But Jericho's story was not one of conquest or empire. It was continuity itself, the persistence of human presence, unbroken across ages. Each rebuilding was both resurrection and inheritance. Each generation lived atop the last, both literally and spiritually. The tell, already high from thousands of years of habitation, grew higher still. The mound was no longer a symbol of decay. It was the proof of endurance. And in that endurance lies the paradox of Jericho. It is both eternal and ephemeral, forever rebuilt, forever collapsing, yet always remembered. The walls that encircled its people, the towers that reached for the sky, the graves that cradled the dead, all were impermanent. What endured was the idea itself, that to dwell in one place is to defy the passing of time. When the night wind moves over the valley, rustling through reeds that drink from the same spring, it carries a whisper older than cities. Build again. It is the same voice that spoke to the first settlers who stayed when others wandered, to the farmers who returned after centuries of dust, to every hand that has ever lifted stone in the name of permanence. By the threshold of the 3rd millennium BC, that voice had become the rhythm of the world. The age of villages was ending. The age of cities had begun. And Jericho, ancient, patient, indestructible, stood at its center, the city that refused to die. Morning light bled slowly over the hills of Canaan, striking the mound that had never truly slept. The air carried the scent of grain and copper and the hum of a city long reborn. Jericho had endured every silence, outlived every collapse, and now it stood again, strong, walled, and gleaming in the sun. By the dawn of the Bronze Age, the world had grown wider and faster. Across the fertile arc of the Near East, cities rose like stars along a vast constellation of trade. Egypt ruled the south with its pharaohs and temples of stone. Mesopotamia glittered to the east under the banners of Sumer and Akkad. Between them, the Levant became a corridor of ambition, a living bridge of caravans, soldiers, and kings. At the heart of that corridor lay Jericho. It was no longer the world's only city, but it was the oldest, and its memory gave it weight. Travelers called it the oasis of the moon, for its nights shimmered silver on the palm fronds, and the walls glowed pale beneath the stars. To those who arrived weary from the desert, it must have seemed like a mirage that had somehow chosen to remain. The settlement had grown once more into a true town, perhaps a small city-state. Its walls, rebuilt countless times, now encircled a sprawl of homes, courtyards, workshops, and shrines. The old Neolithic tower was gone, crumbled centuries before, but its memory lived in the way Jericho still reached upward. Watchtowers guarded its gates, and ramparts ran along its outer edge, thick enough for archers to patrol in pairs. Inside, the city pulsed with life. Narrow streets wound between mud-brick houses, each with flat roofs and shaded courtyards. The air buzzed with the noise of craft, the clang of metal, the creak of presses, the rhythm of millstones. Copper workers hammered tools from imported ingots. Potters shaped vessels with symmetrical precision, and weavers stretched bright threads dyed with crushed minerals. The scent of bread mixed with the acrid tang of smoke. Jericho had become a place of labor and wealth, of dust and song. Beyond its gates stretched the fields, the same fields that had fed countless generations. Wheat and barley waved gold in the breeze. Orchards bloomed with figs and pomegranates, and herds grazed along the slopes. The oasis sustained all of it, its spring still bubbling, from the deep limestone, unbroken since the Ice Age. Water channels, cut by hand and guided by memory, fed every corner of the plain. Trade bound Jericho to the wider world. Caravans from Egypt carried linen, copper, and gold. From the north came obsidian, lapis lazuli, and timber from Lebanon's forests. The roads that crossed through the valley made the city rich and vulnerable. Its rulers, whoever they were, understood that prosperity required vigilance. The city's fortifications reflected that awareness. Archaeological remains tell of a vast defensive system, ramparts layered with stone and clay, retaining walls rising from deep ditches. It was not merely practical engineering, but political theatre, a statement of endurance. The city's strength was meant to be seen. Even so, these walls were more than symbols. They were lifelines. In times of peace, they held back floods. In times of war, they promised safety. Life within them followed rhythms both ancient and new. The people prayed to gods whose names have faded, but whose forms still whisper from fragments of clay idols, figures of fertility and weather, guardians of harvest and hearth. The moon was sacred, perhaps because it shone upon the spring each night, glinting in its waters like an eye that never closed. Festivals were held when the grain was cut and the vats filled with oil. Music rose from reed pipes and drums, echoing off the city walls like heartbeat and thunder. Yet beneath the splendor and ritual, the first tremors of conflict stirred. To the north and south, kingdoms expanded, their ambitions creeping into Canaan's fertile valleys. Armies marched along the same routes that merchants traveled, and peace became a negotiation rather than a certainty. Jericho's position, strategic and rich, made it both a prize and a target. The city's rulers, the earliest of Jericho's kings, are nameless to us. Their palaces, now dust, were likely modest by later standards, built from plaster and timber. But within their walls, the shape of monarchy was forming. The city no longer belonged to everyone. It was commanded, taxed, defended. A ruler's authority depended on grain, soldiers, and the will of the gods. And Jericho had all three. As the Bronze Age deepened, so did connection. Messages written in cuneiform crossed between cities. Diplomacy flourished. Jericho, though smaller than its great neighbors, stood among them as part of this new web of civilization. Clay tablets found elsewhere mention the towns of Canaan paying tribute or forging alliances, and Jericho would have been among them, a participant in the first international order. Still, the old rhythms endured. Beneath the palaces and storehouses, families lived as they always had, grinding, weaving, praying, surviving. Children played by the same spring, their laughter echoing down the same valley where Natufians had once watched herds roam free. The continuity of daily life, unbroken for thousands of years, was Jericho's greatest triumph. But nothing stays untouched. The earth itself began to stir. Along the fault lines of the Jordan Rift, tremors shook the plain. Walls cracked, towers swayed. The same forces that had birthed the valley now threatened to reclaim it. In some layers, traces of destruction appear. Collapsed masonry, burned clay, blackened soil. Whether caused by earthquake or invasion, no one can say. Yet every fall was followed by rebuilding. Jericho had long ago learned that ruin was never the end. By around 2000 BC, the city entered its high point. Its population grew into the thousands. Its walls were repaired once more, stronger than ever, enclosing an area large enough to hold granaries, workshops, and temples. The dead were buried beyond the gates in elaborate tombs, their bodies adorned with bronze jewelry and painted vessels. Wealth had found permanence. In those same centuries, a new tide of power rose from the south. Egypt, now united under its middle kingdom, reached into Canaan. Egyptian merchants and emissaries traveled through the valley, and with them came foreign goods, ideas, and demands. The kings of Jericho balanced between alliance and resistance, their survival depending on diplomacy as much as defense. The trade that had enriched the city also made it vulnerable. Armies followed the same routes as merchants. By the late 2nd millennium BC, the region was caught in a storm of shifting powers. The rise and fall of the Hyksos, the campaigns of pharaohs, the advance of Mitanni and Hittite warlords. Each wave reshaped the map, and Jericho, sitting astride the crossroads, endured them all. Its resilience, however, could not last forever. As centuries passed, the city's glory began to fade. Floods weakened its foundations. Trade routes shifted toward coastal ports. Stronger kingdoms drew power away from the inland plains. The walls that had once protected began to crumble. And yet, even in decline, Jericho's heartbeat never vanished entirely. It would rise again, one final time, before fire and story made it legend. For now, in this age of bronze and dust, Jericho still lived. The air within its gates hummed with the same energy that had animated it since the first walls were laid, the will to endure. Merchants counted coins under the gaze of household idols. Farmers watered fields that had been planted by countless ancestors. Children climbed the low towers to watch the horizon shimmer. They could not know that one day poets and prophets would remember their city not for its life, but for its fall. For the moment, it was enough that the spring still flowed and the walls still stood. Civilization had learned to measure time in ruins, and Jericho was its oldest measure. As the centuries passed, the hum of life inside Jericho softened into something heavier. The Bronze Age, that glittering era of kings and traders, had entered its late twilight. Across the Levant, the great cities trembled, some beneath the tread of invading armies, others under the weight of their own prosperity. Empires swelled and fractured like tides against stone. Jericho, ever ancient, stood in the middle of it all, too small to dominate, too stubborn to disappear. The old rhythm of the oasis continued. The spring flowed clear and constant, feeding palms and barley fields. Herds of goats bleated along the slopes, and caravans still wound through the valley, the air thick with dust and the creak of wooden wheels. Yet within the walls, change had become tension. Each generation rebuilt what the last had lost, but the foundations were beginning to tire. New rulers had come, Canaanite kings, their names forgotten, but their presence marked by palaces and tombs carved with care. They ruled not through kinship, as the old elders once had, but through order and command. Their homes stood apart from the dwellings of their people, decorated with inlaid shells and painted plaster. From their courtyards, they could watch the fields ripple in the sun, and the ramparts glint like gold dust at dusk. Jericho in these centuries was not vast, but it was proud. Its fortifications, layered from generations of rebuilding, rose higher than ever before. Retaining walls of stone supported towers of mud brick, their bases wide enough to defy siege. The ditches that encircled the mound were cut deep and lined with clay, serving both as barriers and flood channels. To an approaching army, the city must have appeared formidable, a fortress grown from the bones of its own history. Inside those walls, daily life still followed its patient rhythm. Market stalls crowded the inner lanes, where merchants bartered for copper and grain. Pottery gleamed in the sunlight, its surfaces painted with spirals and bands of red. bronze weapons, daggers, spearheads, ornaments, hung in workshops beside tools of bone and stone, a reminder that progress always walks beside the past. The city's artisans worked with care, shaping each vessel as though to outlast the fragility of their age. Religion filled the spaces between labor. The people of Jericho still prayed to gods of harvest and storm, to the spirits of the hills and the moon above the valley. Small shrines stood near the gates and in the courtyards of homes, each with its own guardian figure, perhaps the same deity once carved in clay by the first settlers thousands of years earlier. The idea of the divine, like the city itself, refused to vanish. But outside the walls, the world had grown restless. To the north, the city-states of Syria and Mesopotamia clashed in endless rivalry. To the south, Egypt's reach extended once more into Canaan, its pharaohs demanding tribute from the cities of the Levant. Jericho's rulers balanced between power and survival, sending offerings to Egypt while guarding their independence. The trade that had made them rich now carried danger as easily as wealth. Letters from this period, written in cuneiform and discovered in other cities, reveal a network of fear and diplomacy. Kings of Canaan wrote to Egypt, begging for aid against raiders and rivals. Though Jericho's voice is absent from these archives, its position suggests it shared the same fate, caught between loyalty and necessity, between empire and endurance. Then came the storms, both natural and human. Around the middle of the second millennium BC, the region was struck by a series of upheavals. Earthquakes shook the Jordan Rift, tremors cracked the valley floor. Floods followed, eroding the lower walls of Jericho and undermining its defenses. Not long after, signs of fire appeared. Layers of ash, charred beams, shattered pottery. Whether the flames came from invasion, rebellion, or the earth itself, no one can say. For a time, the city died again. The once white plaster of its walls turned black. Its towers collapsed inward. The gates that had opened to merchants now gaped like wounds. And yet, even in ruin, people returned. They always did. Each new generation built atop the ashes of the old, raising walls from the rubble as their ancestors had done for thousands of years. By the late Bronze Age, Jericho had recovered once more, though it was smaller and humbler than before. Its power had waned, but its name endured. The world beyond had grown more violent. Warlike tribes moved across the highlands. Kingdoms rose and fell with alarming speed. Armies carrying bronze-tipped spears passed through the valley, their banners flashing under the desert sun. Each army, it seems, knew the name of Jericho. It was during this turbulent time, perhaps around the 14th century BC, that a final great fortification was raised. Massive ramparts of stone supported mud-brick walls several meters thick. Inside stood storehouses and towers, and a gate system designed to control both trade and threat. Jericho, once again, was ready to defend itself, but defense, as ever, could not defy time. The city's end came suddenly, though the cause remains uncertain. Some speak of war, foreign invaders sweeping in from the east, their trumpets echoing through the valley before the walls fell in dust. Others speak of an earthquake, its tremors collapsing the already weakened structures. Still others see a slower death, abandonment, decay, the slow migration of its people towards safer lands. All that remains certain is this: at some moment in the late second millennium BC, the great walls of Jericho fell. The city that had once been the cradle of civilization became a ruin once more. Beneath the layers of collapse, archaeologists centuries later would find a thick band of ash and rubble. the unmistakable signature of destruction, burned grain sealed beneath fallen bricks, blackened beams resting where roofs had caved in. The fire that ended Jericho burned hot enough to fuse pottery into glass. And yet, as always, silence followed. The spring still flowed through the wreckage, tracing its path past charred walls and broken stones. Plants returned first, then animals. The people who came after, shepherds, wanderers, traders, built small huts atop the ruins, then moved on again. The once great city was reduced to memory. In time, that memory became myth. The story of its fall traveled by word of mouth, reshaped by generations of retelling. Long after its towers had vanished, its name still carried weight. When later tribes crossed the Jordan and found the abandoned mound, they saw in its shattered stones not geology, but divine proof, a miracle of conquest and faith. Thus, Jericho entered Scripture, not as the first city, but as the first to fall. The legend of trumpets and collapsing walls would one day eclipse the real story. The centuries of patient building, of quiet labor, of walls raised not for war, but for survival. Yet even in legend, the truth lingers. The people who built Jericho had already achieved what the world would spend millennia trying to repeat: the transformation of earth and water into home, of time into continuity. After the destruction, life returned in fragments. Small communities settled at the edge of the tell, living among the ruins, cultivating the same fertile ground. The Bronze Age ended, and the Iron Age began. Empires rose to claim the land: the Egyptians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians. But Jericho remained a shadow, its greatness buried beneath its own history. Still, the spring flowed as it always had, and in that ceaseless water lay the city's truest immortality. Every reed that bends in its current, every ripple that catches the light, carries the memory of those who once believed they could outlast time. They could not, but the idea they left behind did. Jericho's story was never about victory or defeat. It was about endurance, the endless human impulse to rebuild, even when the past lies in ashes. Beneath the weight of empire and legend, the tell remains what it has always been: the memory of the first home, still whispering to those who stand upon it that nothing built with purpose is ever truly lost. The spring of Anis Sultan has never stopped flowing. Even now, it runs clear beneath the palms, winding between the hills where the first builders once raised their walls. The water still gathers in shallow pools that mirror the desert sky, and on the far horizon, the faint shimmer of the Dead Sea glows white under the sun. Nothing else remains of the ancient city, only this steady voice of the earth, whispering across 12,000 years. By the dawn of the Iron Age, Jericho was a memory already fading into story. The once mighty ramparts had long since collapsed, leaving mounds of tumbled stone and mud brick overgrown with grass. A few scattered families farmed the fields nearby, unaware that they were living atop the bones of the first civilization. Yet stories lingered in the soil. Travelers crossing the valley could still see the rise of the tell from afar, a strange, unnatural hill, too regular to be mere accident. They wondered who had built it and what god had struck it down. Generations later, those questions would take on divine meaning. In the pages of Scripture, Jericho was reborn, not as a city of merchants and masons, but as a symbol. It became the fortress that fell not to armies or siegecraft, but to faith. According to the book of Joshua, it was here that the Israelites, newly come into Canaan, encircled the city for 7 days, trumpets blaring, until the walls crumbled by the will of God. The story was never meant as history alone. It was revelation, a declaration that faith could triumph over stone. And so the first city became the first miracle. The irony is quiet but profound. Jericho, which had once embodied humanity's triumph over nature, became in legend a lesson in submission to the divine. Its builders had raised walls to endure. Its conquerors remembered it for falling. In that inversion lies the essence of myth. Where archaeology preserves what was, story preserves what mattered. To later civilizations, Jericho stood as both warning and promise. For poets, it symbolized hubris undone. For prophets, faith rewarded. The city that had birthed permanence became a reminder that nothing built by human hands lasts forever. Yet within that loss was also continuity, because each retelling, each echo of the trumpet's sound kept Jericho alive. As centuries rolled forward, new peoples claimed the valley. The Canaanites gave way to Israelites, Israelites to Babylonians, then Persians, then Greeks and Romans. The mound changed hands and names, but it never disappeared. Each empire built anew on its crest or in its shadow. Each left traces, pottery shards, coins, foundations, even walls of their own. By the time of Herod the Great, Jericho had become a resort city of palm gardens and aqueducts, its ancient tell long since abandoned but never forgotten. It is strange how the past lingers. In every age, someone looked at the hill and wondered who had come before. Some thought it cursed, others sacred. Pilgrims visiting the Holy Land in late antiquity pointed to the ruins as proof of the Bible's truth, though none could say where the trumpet walls truly stood. The centuries blurred myth and memory together until the real Jericho vanished beneath its own legend. Then, at last, the spade began to answer the trumpet. In the 19th century, travelers and explorers, Europeans driven by faith, curiosity, or empire, arrived in the valley to dig. They found walls, indeed, but not the ones they expected. The layers beneath the mound spoke not of Joshua's conquest, but of something older, deeper, astonishingly ancient. Beneath the ruins of Canaanite, Jericho lay Neolithic Jericho, its stones still holding the shape of humanity's first city. The myth had led them here, but the truth they uncovered was greater still. When Kathleen Kenyon began her excavations in the 1950s, the story of Jericho changed forever. Her careful cuts into the mound revealed more than a sequence of ruins. They revealed time itself, layered in soil and dust. Each stratum was a chapter: the early Natufian huts, the first plastered floors, the great wall and tower, the long silence, the rebirth of the Bronze Age city. Under her hands, the myth of Joshua gave way to something older, though no less miraculous: the sheer persistence of humanity. Kenyon's work confirmed that Jericho's earliest walls predated the biblical story by thousands of years. They had stood before writing, before metal, before kings. Yet even as science stripped the story of its literal truth, it deepened its meaning. The idea of walls falling at a divine command became, in another sense, prophetic. Every age has watched its fortresses collapse, by time, by flood, by the quiet erosion of the world. In Jericho's story, both versions coexist: the faith that moves mountains and the hands that built them. Today, the tell still rises above the valley floor, weathered but unmistakable. The remains of the Neolithic tower stand half buried, a circular hollow where steps once spiraled upward. Around it, the traces of walls, homes, and courtyards unfold like the faint outline of a forgotten map. The site is small, smaller than legend would suggest, but its meaning is vast. Beneath each meter of soil lies an epoch of human becoming. Standing there, one can see, within a few square meters, the span of our species' transformation, from hunter to builder, from mythmaker to historian. Tourists still come, drawn by both scripture and science. Some seek the city of Joshua, others the city of Kenyon. Most find both. The guide's voice drifts through the heat, retelling the old story. The trumpets, the shouting, the fall. Then comes the quieter truth, that Jericho's earliest walls fell not to divine wrath, but to time and renewal. The listeners nod, and in their eyes, both tales seem to merge. Faith and fact are not enemies here. They are layers in the same tell. The spring, of course, still runs beside the site, as it always has. It fed the Natufians, the Canaanites, the Israelites, and the modern farmers who work its fields today. The water is clear, sweet, and constant. Children still swim in it on hot afternoons. They do not know that it is the oldest living witness to civilization, older than writing, older than the pyramids, older than the very gods once prayed to in its reflection. In that spring lies the soul of Jericho, the element that never needed rebuilding. It is the one piece of the ancient world still alive in the present. Every ripple that catches the sun carries 12,000 years of memory. Perhaps that is why Jericho endures. Not because its walls stood strong, but because its heart was never still. It is less a city than an idea, the promise that humanity, no matter how many times it falls, will build again. When archaeologists stand on the mound at dusk, the valley darkens and the light turns bronze. The call to prayer drifts from modern Jericho nearby, mingling with the whisper of wind over the stones. The tell is quiet, but not silent. It hums with the memory of hands and voices long gone. And if one listens closely enough, the centuries seem to blur. The shouts of the first builders, the trumpets of the Israelites, the clatter of Kenyon's trowel, all part of the same unending chorus. History and myth, science and faith. Here, they are not opposites, but reflections. Each layer reveals what the other hides. The myth gives the city meaning. The earth gives it truth. And between them flows the spring, eternal and indifferent, reminding us that the two are inseparable. So Jericho remains, the first city, the eternal city, the city that refuses to vanish. Its walls may have fallen 100 times, but its name still rises from the dust. The builders are gone, their gods forgotten, their towers swallowed by time. Yet the idea they left behind still shapes the world. The conviction that from dust, something lasting can be made. Perhaps that is the true miracle of Jericho. When the light fades and the valley sinks into shadow, the tell glows faintly in the twilight, and the first stars appear above it. They are the same stars that watched the hunters gather by the spring, the same stars that shone on Joshua's march, the same stars that now gleam over the archaeologists' tents. 12 millennia have passed, and yet the scene is unchanged. Stone, water, and sky, each keeping its own time. If you listen closely, you can almost hear it, the faint echo of wind through the hollow of the ancient tower, the whisper of the first builders as they laid their stones. It is the sound of civilization beginning, and perhaps beginning still.